Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that while you slept, strangers in a room thousands of miles away had divided everything you owned, everything your ancestors built, and everything your children would inherit between themselves. No one asked you, no one told you, and by the time you found out, the borders were already drawn. This is not a hypothetical, this happened to an entire continent in your lifetime's memory, and the world has never fully reckoned with it.
Before a single European boot touched African soil in the colonial era, before a single line was drawn on a single map in a single conference room in Berlin, there was a continent that the history books have spent 2 centuries pretending was empty. It was not empty, it was full. Full of cities and kingdoms and trade networks and legal systems and military structures and philosophical traditions and architectural achievements that would have startled the men who later claimed to be bringing civilization to a place that already had it. Walk through West Africa in 1800 and you are walking through the territory of the Ashanti Confederacy, a sophisticated political federation in what is now Ghana, whose capital Kumasi was a city of extraordinary wealth and organization, whose army had never been defeated, whose legal system governed millions of people with a precision that European colonial administrators would later struggle to replicate. Move east and you find the Sokoto Caliphate in what is now northern Nigeria, the largest state in Africa at that time, governing perhaps 10 million people, with a system of emirate administration and Islamic scholarship that was producing surplus food and export trade, while European observers were writing that Africans had no capacity for governance. Move south and you find the Zulu Kingdom. Move further and you find the Ethiopian Empire. Ancient, Christian, literate, diplomatically sophisticated, watching the European approach with the specific wariness of a civilization old enough to know what it was looking at. This is the continent that the Berlin Conference of 1884 divided between 14 European nations in a matter of months. Not an empty space. A continent full of civilizations, and the people whose worlds were divided were not consulted. Not one African representative was present in the room where their continent was distributed among strangers. To understand why 14 European nations sat down in Berlin in 1884 and divided a continent between themselves, you have to understand what was happening inside those nations in the decades before. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe in a generation. The cotton mills, the steel furnaces, the shipyards were machines of extraordinary productive capacity that needed 2 things in constant increasing supply: raw materials and markets. Europe's own territories were not sufficient for either. In London, Cecil Rhodes was articulating the logic plainly. We must find new lands from which we can obtain raw materials and exploit the cheap labor of the natives. In Brussels, King Leopold II was presenting himself as a humanitarian interested in ending the Arab slave trade, while what he actually wanted was a private estate the size of Western Europe. In Berlin, Bismarck called the conference. And alongside the economics ran an ideology that made all of it feel not merely profitable but righteous. The civilizing mission, the white man's burden. The belief that European civilization was not merely different from African civilization, but superior to it. That spreading European systems across Africa was not conquest but uplift. The men in the conference room called it their duty. The people of Africa called it by other names. Before the soldiers came, the explorers came. David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, Mungo Park. Men who moved through the African interior and produced the maps and reports that made colonial conquest logistically possible. From the European perspective, these men were heroes of discovery. From the African perspective, they were the advanced scouts of an invasion. Their maps were tools that would be used to divide a continent they did not own. Stanley in particular navigated the Congo River and produced the first detailed European map of the Congo Basin. When he returned to Europe with those maps, King Leopold II was waiting for him. Their meeting produced the agreement that would create the Congo Free State. Stanley returned to Africa as Leopold's agent, signing treaties with Congo Basin chiefs in which he exchanged goods for their agreement to surrender sovereignty. Many of these chiefs had no European language and no legal framework for understanding what they were signing. They believed they were entering into trade agreements. They were signing away their countries. November 15, 1884, a conference room in Berlin. Bismarck calls to order a gathering that will, over the next 3 months, formalize the division of an entire continent. 14 European nations present, not one African nation, not one African representative, not one African voice. The continent being divided is not in the room. 3 principles were established. Effective occupation, meaning a European nation had to actually administer what it claimed. Freedom of navigation on African rivers for European commerce, and most consequentially, the principle that African peoples had no legal standing in the determination of sovereignty over their own lands. The lines drawn were drawn with a freedom that could only exist in the complete absence of the people whose lives those lines would govern. A line drawn through the Sahara had no idea it was drawn through the migration routes of the Tuareg. A line drawn along a river had no idea the river was a boundary between peoples who had lived in organized relationship for centuries. Between 1880 and 1914, the European share of Africa went from approximately 20% to approximately 90%. The conference room in Berlin did not draw every line, but it gave Europe permission to draw them. And Europe drew them with extraordinary speed. Among all the African nations facing European colonial expansion, one refused to fall. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia purchased European weapons from France and Russia, built an army of 100,000 soldiers equipped with modern rifles and artillery, and waited. On March 1, 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, the Italian force of 17,000 soldiers was destroyed, 7,000 killed, 1,500 wounded, 3,000 taken prisoner in a single day. From the Italian perspective, a national humiliation that reverberated for decades. From the African perspective, proof that European colonial forces were not invincible. Proof that the civilizing missions claimed to inevitability was false. The news of Adwa spread across the continent and across the Atlantic, received by people of African descent with an intensity that the Italian Foreign Ministry would have found bewildering. Adwa did not stop the scramble. The rest of the continent had already fallen. But it established a truth that the colonial powers could not erase from the historical record, and that independence movements would draw on 60 years later. King Leopold II of Belgium never visited the Congo. He administered his private estate from Brussels, through a system of colonial officials and force public soldiers whose primary function was the enforcement of rubber quotas. Each village was assigned a rubber quota. Failure to meet it was punishable by hostage-taking, mutilation, and death. The force publique enforced the quotas with a systematic brutality that had a specific signature: the severing of hands. Photographs of Congolese children who had lost their hands became the documentary evidence that eventually forced the international investigation that ended Leopold's rule. The population of the Congo Basin, estimated at 20 million in 1880, was reduced by approximately 10 million by 1920, through killing, starvation, and the deliberate destruction of communities. Edmund Morel and Roger Casement, through years of investigation and public exposure, eventually forced Leopold to cede the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908. Leopold died in 1909, one of the wealthiest men in Europe, having faced no legal consequence for what had been done in his name. By 1914, the partition of Africa was complete. The lines drawn became the national borders of independent African states in the 1950s and 1960s, inherited intact. To understand what those borders did, look at specific cases. The U people, divided between British Gold Coast and German Togoland, became citizens of two different countries at independence. The Somali people were divided between 5 different colonial jurisdictions. The conflicts that followed are not ancient tribal hatreds. They are modern conflicts produced by 19th century European administrative decisions. The reverse problem was equally damaging. Colonial borders enclosed within single units peoples who had no previous political relationship, who spoke different languages, practiced different religions. The tensions produced by these arrangements, exacerbated by colonial policies that played communities against each other, generated conflicts that consumed the post-independence period. Today, 55 African nations carry the borders of the colonial partition, drawn by men who had never visited the territories they were dividing, on maps of varying accuracy, in negotiations whose primary purpose was the management of European diplomatic relationships. Africans resisted, at every point, everywhere. The Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, where a Zulu army destroyed a British force of 1,300 soldiers in less than 2 hours. The Herero and Nama uprising in German Southwest Africa in 1904, which produced what historians now recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. 80,000 people killed under a formal extermination order. The Maji-Maji Rebellion in East Africa, drawing 20 different ethnic groups together in a coordinated uprising suppressed by deliberate famine that killed 300,000 people. These resistances were defeated. The asymmetry of industrial military technology meant that outcome was often predictable. But the resistance tells a different story about African agency than the passive narrative of colonial history. And when military resistance became impossible, resistance took other forms: cultural, spiritual, legal. The resistance never stopped. It changed form. And when the conditions changed sufficiently, it became the independence movements that dismantled the colonial empire in a single generation. Africa was the wealthiest continent on Earth in natural resources when the Berlin Conference convened in 1884. South Africa's gold fields produced 1/3 of the world's gold. The Congo's rubber provided the raw material for the automobile era. The copper belt wired the electrical infrastructure of the modern world. These were the foundational inputs of modern industrial civilization, and they came overwhelmingly from Africa at prices set by colonial powers, with profits captured almost entirely by European companies and shareholders. The agricultural systems that had fed African populations for centuries were dismantled and replaced with cash crop monocultures grown for export. The labor that built colonial infrastructure was coerced at no wage cost. The 60 to 80 years of the colonial period were the decades in which industrialization created the modern world. The nations that controlled their own resources during this period built the capacity that organizes contemporary prosperity. The nations that had their resources extracted did not build that capacity. The inequality between Africa and the industrialized world today is not a natural condition. It is a produced condition, produced in Berlin in 1884 and in the decades that followed. Here is where this story reaches you. The borders that the Berlin Conference authorized are today the borders of 55 African nations. The economic structures of colonialism persisted beyond independence because dismantling them required capital and institutional capacity, the new states did not possess. The pattern of extraction continued under new arrangements. The political instability that has characterized post-independence African history is routinely described as evidence of African incapacity for self-governance. This description inverts the causality. The instability was produced by colonialism and inherited by independence. Africa was the wealthiest continent in natural resources in 1884. It remains the most rich in natural resources and the most poor in developed wealth today. That distance between what was there and what remained is the full measure of what one conference room in one city produced in one winter. I will leave you with one question. The scramble for Africa was legal under the international law of its time, endorsed by the major powers, justified by an ideology its practitioners believed sincerely. Does legality make it right? And what does a world built substantially on what Africa lost owe to the continent it took apart? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one.